My name is John Passfield, and the title of this reading will be The Poetic Novel 1, Video 8, Thomas Wolfe. This is my book, The Poetic Novel 1. Let me hold it up here. Influences and Elements by John Passfield. The three roses are from Gertrude Stein. A rose is a rose is a rose. A very famous saying about imagery. It's not a published book, but can best be accessed for free on my website, johnpassfield.ca. I'm going to read from a chapter in that book in which I discuss the career of Thomas Wolfe. So note 8, Thomas Wolfe. The story of Thomas Wolfe is an interesting one. I read his novels, short stories, biography, and criticism about his work before I started to write my series of novels. I was intrigued by his talent as a writer, and no doubt was drawn to him for his similarities to Proust. But it was his biography which caught my imagination the most. I came to see a mythical pattern in the life and career of Thomas Wolfe, one which reinforced my sense of the writer's calling and its pitfalls, which I had developed while studying the works and lives of such writers as Conrad, Henry James, and Virginia Woolf. I came to see the Thomas Wolfe experience as a touchstone for my own writing career, and have referred to him in my notebooks and journals as a writer whose creative career was short-circuited for a number of reasons. So a warning, I guess, a biography of a writer as a warning. Watch out, this could happen to you. Over the years, I've studied the works of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Thomas Wolfe. When I study a writer, I read the fiction, critical responses to the fiction, and biographies, and even watch films which have been derived from the fiction. I was drawn to Hemingway and Fitzgerald on my own and taught their novels and stories long before I thought of writing novels myself. Later, my focus on a certain kind of novel led me to study Virginia Woolf, which in turn led me to study Marcel Proust, which then led me to study Thomas Wolfe as a more contemporary writer of a Proustian bent. It was the study of Thomas Wolfe as a Proustian writer which led me to become interested in Maxwell Perkins, who was, of course, the editor of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Wolfe. So the dynamics of the interaction of an editor and a writer I found very, very fascinating. Two of the biographies which I have on my shelf are Look Homer, The Life of Thomas Wolfe by David Herbert Donald, which I can't find easily. It's in my house somewhere. And Maxwell Perkins, Editor of Genius by Scott Berg. So I'll just hold that up. That's one of the biographies that may be quite familiar with the details of Wolfe's life. My copy of Berg's book is dated January 1990. And although there's no date in my copy of the Donald book, I read it at about the same time. So 1990 was about 10 years before I began to write my series of novels, 1998, so 8 years. I recently watched the film Genius, which is about the relationship between Maxwell Perkins, the editor, and Thomas Wolfe, the writer. It was enjoyable to watch the film, as I knew the original story quite well. However, what I found there was exactly the opposite of what I had come to think of as the Perkins-Wolfe relationship. So the relationship between an editor and a writer. Here's a quote from Berg's book. Of Time and the River sprung from the symbiotic union of two artistic forces, Wolfe's passion and Perkins's judgment. So the writer's passion and the editor's judgment. The two men had been at frequent odds, but together they both had accomplished the greatest work of their careers. That's the quote. Here's my comment on it from this essay in my book, The Poetic Novel. The film, I felt, was quite dramatic in that it allowed me to come to the conclusion that I will outline below. However, when I watched the accompanying interviews with Scott Berg, on whose Wolfe biography the film was based, and with the director and principal actors, I realized that they were all workers in the collaborative medium of stage and film, and all agreed that the premise of the film was the same as that of the Berg biography, as summarized in this quotation. Two geniuses working together to create one artistic project. This was their point. It was to them a case of a writer who had to be restrained, and an editor who knew exactly how to shape a novel for the reading public. So the greater of the two geniuses was the editor, because the writer needed a lot of help. That's a simple way of stating it. Number 3, section number 3 is another quote from the biography. Wolfe had intended his 3 books as a series of widening concentric circles. The first gave a picture of the Gant-Pentland family. The second portrayed Altamont. The third gave a view of the state of Old Catawba and of the South as a whole. So he planned 3 sections. What connected these was the cyclical curve of a family life. Perkins, who had only the faintest understanding of the whole plan, thought much of this manuscript was simply irrelevant. So a writer has a manuscript that has many things in it. The editor looks at the manuscript and says most of that manuscript is irrelevant. Irrelevant to what? Well, irrelevant to the book we're trying to make together, editor and writer. Okay, here's me speaking again in my essay. I had been led to Thomas Wolfe as an example of a Proustian novelist. A Proustian novelist feels that the life that we live consciously is only the surface of the life that we are living. He or she sees the details of the surface of that life as the imagery out of which the thinking person can respond to that life. The surface information becomes imagery by 2 artistic acts. 2 dashes here, but I'll number them. Number 1, the juxtaposition in retrospect of various pieces of life experience information which did not come into contact in the linear experience of the living of that life, hence the time dislocations of discontinued narrative. Very simply, if you take a picture of yourself on your wedding day and a picture of yourself on your 50th anniversary day, they did not happen contiguously, those 2 events, but you put them side by side, you get an idea about your life, your marriage, and so on, right? So you as a 20-year-old, you as a 60-year-old, 2 pictures side by side, okay? That's what this kind of novel does, the Proustian novel. Number 2, the interlayering of deepening imagery, which appears to have little connection with the surface imagery of the life experience, which acts as imagery which suggests ways of interpreting life experience imagery. So the actual life and then something beside it. Politicians find this when they used to open newspapers. Now they would look on TV and see a cartoon of themselves, or Saturday Night Live, they see somebody imitating them. A cartoon version of yourself by an actor on a TV show. The real life and the imagery of the life side by side, one commenting on the other. Okay, that's the point there. The above plan of the Wolfe novel does not interest me in detail, as Wolfe came up with quite a number of plans over the gestation and writing period of what became his 2nd, 3rd, and 4th published novels. But it does suggest that Wolfe saw his projected novel as a series of circles which were to be dependent on one another for meaning. In my own sense of novel form, I see these concentric circles as the layers of an archaeological dig, with each layer indicating a sphere of experience which is unique and separate from the others, while also being connected thematically to the others and dependent on its interaction with them as a means of suggesting meaning to the main character and to a reader. So highly complex novels require a lot of things in them. Proustian literature, Wolffian literature, works by a series of parallels and contrasts and needs many circles or layers of imagery in order to achieve the thematic density which serious literature demands. It is clear to me that in order to fulfill this plan, or any of the other plans which Thomas Wolfe noted or explained to his editor, it was necessary for him, Thomas Wolfe, to write a number of seemingly unrelated stories, seemingly unrelated to the editor, and to interlayer them, when completed, into a vast novel which would be composed of thematically interconnected and image interactive narratives. So Thomas Wolfe planned a book of many narratives, all commenting on each other by parallel and contrast. His editors said, no, we want one simple narrative. The rest is irrelevant. Okay. I won't read the whole essay at this time, but you can read it at my website, johnpassfield.ca. For this reading, I'll read my conclusion about the career of Thomas Wolfe. So back to my essay for the final section, having not read many of the sections on this occasion. I can't say that Thomas Wolfe would have written a successful Proustian novel if he had been allowed himself to follow his natural writing process. I can say that with Perkins as his editor, there was no chance of writing one. That is what Thomas Wolfe realized, and that is why he left Scribner's, his publisher, and Perkins, his editor. The most commonly used and most misused cliche of our time is to think outside the box. In art, the box is the parameters of the current art form. In literature, the role of the editor is as the guardian of the parameters of the box. Editors are the sheepdogs who keep the creative sheep of the era on familiar paths. No one but the artist can know the shape of the projected artwork, as no one else can know the artistic vision which is struggling to produce the work of art which will embody that vision. Thomas Wolfe was not secure enough in that vision to fight off Maxwell Perkins when Perkins inadvertently, with all the goodwill in the world, sought to damage and short-circuit that artistic vision in favor of his own editorial vision. So he wanted to give Thomas Wolfe and his company, Scribner's, a best-selling item of literature, and he did. But he did great damage without realizing it. The lesson which I took from the story of Thomas Wolfe is that a creative writer has to be his or her own best editor and best critic. Number one, to accept all suggestions was further the initial aim of the creative project. And number two, to reject all suggestions which threaten to distort or derail the creative endeavor. And to do this, the writer has to know the difference. The ideal writer is the one with a healthy balance of the creative and critical faculties. The successful work of art is a product of the two. So a last little bit here in this essay. With the story of Thomas Wolfe in mind, I have followed the Proustian method. I have written 19 novels and self-published most of them. I was halfway through my 18th novel when I was accepted by a publisher, David Stover of Rocks Mills Press. I insisted, and the publisher agreed, that I would have final say over every word of every one of my future novels. Well, to date, I'm reading this in 2023, there are 29 novels, 4 novellas, and 1 almost complete, which will make a 5th novella. So here's a conclusion. Here's a note that I wrote while looking over this essay for this video presentation. Okay, so it's separate, but it's still connected in terms of how to write poetic novels. This is my main topic. I wrote a note in either the planning notebook or the journal for my novel Death Day, The Apology of Sergei Eisenstein, in which I said that the conditions that are necessary for the creation of serious art are extremely rare. That novel is based on the premise that these conditions all came together in the most positive way for the creation of one of Eisenstein's films, Battleship Potemkin, in the mid-1920s. And the conditions that threatened to undermine the creation of serious art all came together during the attempt to make another of Eisenstein's films, Que Viva Mexico, in the mid-1930s. So he had all of the best conditions for art happened to him in 1925 or so. He had all of the worst conditions of art happened to him in the mid-30s. Of course, the great underminer of serious art for Eisenstein was the desire for orthodoxy by those in power during the communist regime in Soviet Russia. Paradoxically, though, when the Soviet experiment was new, the artist Sergei Eisenstein had all of the freedom he needed, all of the money he needed, and all of the resources he needed to make a great work of film art. The other half of the paradox is that when he was in the United States and Mexico and only had to deal with the demands of a capitalist society, he was unable to make a great work of serious film art due to the demands of the commercial marketplace. Now, there's no way of knowing what the blend of artistic purpose and economic necessity is in any of the great works of literary art that we have on our shelves. It's only when the blend becomes so very one-sided, as it was in the case of Thomas Wolfe, when his novel was taken away from him and reshaped behind his back, as it were, to meet the demands of the literary marketplace, that we realize the enormous pressure that artists, even in our free society, are under when they struggle to produce their works of literary art. In light of the fact that literary art is written somewhere between the two poles of the complexity of actual life reality and the familiarity and popularity of conventional literary forms, we should be grateful that serious literature is ever produced at all. So, this is my book, The Poetic Novel 1, and it's not available as a physical book that you can buy, but it's available for free access on my website, johnpasfield.ca. So have a look there. Just look for the icon and click on it, and there's the book. Lastly, I'll just say thank you for watching this video.